On the morning of May 29, 1453, the strongest walls on earth cracked open like an eggshell, and behind them, 1,000 years of history bled out into the streets of the most fortified city ever built, Constantinople, the city that had survived Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and even the violence of Christian crusaders, the city ringed by triple walls so massive that armies had broken themselves against them for a millennium, was about to die, not slowly, not with dignity, but in a single, catastrophic dawn that would echo through every century that followed. What happened in the next 12 hours would not just end an empire. It would slam shut the Middle Ages, fracture the Mediterranean world, and send shockwaves that would birth the Renaissance, ignite the age of exploration, and rewrite the very concept of what walls could protect you from. This wasn't just a siege. This was the moment when medieval certainty met modern violence, and certainty lost. The air above the Bosphorus hung thick and copper-tasted in the spring of 1453, the kind of stillness that comes before a world splits in two. Fog drifted off the water in the pre-dawn cold, clinging to stone ramparts that had stood since Rome itself still ruled the West, curling around towers that had watched empires rise and collapse and rise again. The city of Constantinople sat wedged between two continents, protected on three sides by water and on the fourth by the Theodosian walls, a fortress system so monumental that it seemed less like architecture and more like a declaration of permanence etched into the earth's crust. 3 lines of defense, each higher and thicker than the last, studded with 96 towers, fronted by a moat 60 feet wide, designed not by men, but by the kind of engineers who believed they were building something that would outlast history itself. And for over 1,000 years, they had been right. But on that particular morning, with the mist rising and the first light catching on the bronze dome of Hagia Sophia, the walls were bleeding dust from 100 fresh wounds, and the men standing atop them knew, in the way soldiers know when the end is close, that all the stone in the world might not be enough. On the Byzantine side of those crumbling ramparts stood Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of the last fragment of the Roman Empire, a man who wore the purple not as a symbol of power, but as a funeral shroud, had been born to carry. He was not a conqueror, not a builder of new worlds. He was the keeper of an old one, the guardian of a city that had once commanded half the known world and now controlled barely the ground beneath its own feet. Constantine was 48 years old, trained in statecraft and war, crowned in a city that had no coronation regalia left because the previous emperors had sold the jewels to pay for food. He ruled over perhaps 50,000 souls crammed inside walls that had once sheltered 500,000, governed an empire that existed only in name, its territories reduced to the city itself and a few pathetic coastal strips that wouldn't fill a decent province. But Constantine was not a man who fled. He had refused exile, refused negotiation, refused the comfortable surrender that would have let him live out his years in some minor Italian court, recounting the glories of a dead civilization. Instead, he stood on the walls, sword in hand, because he understood something fundamental about his role in history. He was not there to win. He was there to make sure that when the end came, it came with a fight worthy of remembrance. Arrayed against him was not merely an army, but a theological certainty given form and flesh and bronze cannons. A force that represented not just conquest, but the unstoppable momentum of a new world, devouring an old one. Mehmed II, just 21 years old, sat in his silk pavilion less than a mile from the walls, surrounded by maps and astrologers, and the kind of absolute confidence that comes when you command 100,000 men and believe God himself has authored your destiny. Mehmed was not a mere sultan. He was the culmination of Ottoman expansion, the latest and most dangerous in a line of warriors who had carved an empire out of Anatolia and the Balkans with systematic, terrifying efficiency. Where his predecessors had built, he would complete. Where they had dreamed, he would deliver. He had staked his legitimacy, his throne, perhaps his very soul on the conquest of this single city, because Mehmed understood what every historian and prophet had whispered for centuries. Whoever held Constantinople held the key to 2 continents, controlled the trade routes between East and West, and could claim to be the rightful heir not just to the Ottomans, but to Rome itself. He had gathered Anatolian cavalry, Balkan infantry, elite janissaries trained from childhood to kill without hesitation, Serbian miners to dig under walls, Hungarian engineers to build cannons that defied imagination, and a navy that blackened the Bosphorus with sails. This was not an army assembled to besiege. This was an army assembled to erase. What would be decided in the coming hours was not merely the fate of a city, but whether the medieval world, the world of stone walls and chivalric codes, and the assumption that certain things were simply too strong to fall, could survive contact with gunpowder, mathematics, and the cold industrial logic of modern war. If Constantinople held, it would prove that courage and stone could still defeat numbers and innovation, that the old certainties still mattered, that some things were indeed too sacred, too fortified, too historically inevitable to be destroyed. If it fell, then everything, every castle, every kingdom, every assumption about how power worked, would have to be rewritten. The walls had held for 1,123 years. They had held against Attila's Huns, against the Persian Empire at its apex, against Arab sieges that lasted years, against earthquakes and fires and the rot of time itself. But they had never faced anything like what was about to hit them. Because Mehmed had brought something new to the gates of history, he had brought the future. To understand how the most fortified city on earth died in a single morning, you have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when Constantinople stopped being the center of the world and started being its memory. Once, this city had been the beating heart of Christendom, the richest metropolis in Europe, the place where Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology fused into a civilization that saw itself as eternal. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that had survived the Western collapse by 1,000 years, had ruled from Britain to Jerusalem, had commanded armies that spoke a dozen languages, had produced art and architecture and legal codes that defined what it meant to be civilized. But empires are like organisms. They age, they weaken, they lose pieces of themselves until what remains is mostly memory and pride. By the 15th century, Byzantium was a ghost haunting its own palaces. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 had gutted it, Latin invaders sacking the city with a thoroughness that would have impressed the barbarians who destroyed Rome. Byzantium recovered, technically, but it recovered the way a man recovers from a mortal wound, still breathing, still moving, but never whole again. Piece by piece, century by century, the empire contracted. Anatolia fell to Turkish emirates. The Balkans fragmented into rival kingdoms. Greek islands were seized by Venetians and Genoese. By 1450, the empire that had once commanded millions ruled a capital city and a few scattered towns, surrounded on all sides by the expanding Ottoman Sultanate, like an island of old stone in a rising tide of conquest. And the Ottomans were not interested in coexistence. They were interested in completion. For 2 centuries they had built their empire on the bones of Byzantine territory, absorbing its lands, besieging its cities, strangling its trade routes, until Constantinople sat isolated in the center of Ottoman Anatolia, like a Christian splinter in Muslim flesh. Sultan after sultan had looked at those walls and imagined their banners flying from the towers. Murad II, Mehmed's father, had besieged the city and failed, turned back by walls and storms, and the logistical nightmare of sustaining an army outside fortifications that good. But when Murad died in 1451, his son took the throne with a singular obsession. Mehmed was young, but he was not naive. He had studied the sieges of Alexander, the tactics of Caesar, the engineering principles of every conqueror who had ever broken a city. He knew that Constantinople could not be starved into submission. It could be resupplied by sea. It could not be intimidated into surrender. It had survived too many threats to flinch at one more. It could only be broken, and breaking it would require tools that did not yet fully exist. So Mehmed spent 2 years preparing not just an army, but an industrial complex dedicated to one purpose: building cannons large enough to crack the Theodosian walls. The man who made it possible was named Orban, a Hungarian engineer who had first offered his services to Constantine, promising to build guns that could defend the city. Constantine, bankrupt and desperate, could not afford him. Mehmed could. Mehmed gave Orban unlimited resources, a foundry, and a single instruction: build me something that can break God's own fortress. What Orban produced was a monster, the largest cannon ever constructed up to that point in history, a bronze tube 27 feet long, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds, more than a mile. It required 60 oxen to move, 200 men to operate, and it could fire approximately 7 times a day before the barrel needed to cool or risk exploding. But when it fired, it hit with the force of controlled thunder, and stone walls designed to absorb the impact of battering rams and catapults cracked under the kinetic energy of mass traveling at physics-defying speed. Mehmed had not just commissioned a weapon. He had commissioned a paradigm shift. Walls would never mean the same thing again. The Byzantines knew what was coming. They had spies, merchants, deserters who brought news of the foundries, the troop movements, the enormous guns being dragged slowly overland toward the capital. Constantine sent desperate letters to the west, begging for aid, for soldiers, for ships, for anything that might balance the scales. The Pope promised help if Byzantium would submit to Rome's religious authority, healing the schism that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for 400 years. Constantine, with no other options, agreed. A small contingent of Genoese soldiers arrived, led by Giovanni Giustiniani, a professional mercenary who was one of the finest siege commanders in Europe. Giustiniani brought 700 men. Against 100,000, it was a rounding error, but it was something. The Venetians sent a few ships. A handful of Italian adventurers came, motivated by faith or gold or the grim romanticism of defending the last Christian city in the East. In total, Constantine could muster maybe 7,000 to 8,000 defenders, half of them civilians handed spears and told to stand on walls they barely understood. Across the walls, Mehmed had 80,000 to 100,000 fighters. Thousands of cavalry, engineers, sappers, archers, artillery crews, and the most elite infantry in the world. The Janissaries, Christian boys taken as children, converted, trained, until warfare was the only language they spoke, loyal only to the Sultan who had made them into weapons. But here's the thing about sieges. Numbers don't tell the whole story. Walls equalize. Walls turn warfare into a grinding calculus of endurance and morale and logistics. Constantinople had survived against impossible odds before because the Theodosian walls were not just thick, they were brilliant. 3 defensive lines meant that even if the outer wall fell, attackers had to fight uphill, through a kill zone to reach the second wall, then do it again to reach the third. The defenders could retreat, regroup, counterattack from higher ground, while the attackers were exhausted and exposed. The walls had towers every 60 meters, overlapping fields of fire. Gates designed to funnel invaders into choke points where they could be slaughtered wholesale. And then there was the Golden Horn, the inlet on the city's northern side, blocked by a massive chain stretched across the water to prevent enemy ships from sailing in. As long as that chain held, the northern walls were safe. As long as the defenders could repair damage at night, the bombardment was survivable. As long as morale held, the siege could be endured. Constantine knew this. Mehmed knew this. The question was, who would break first, the walls or the will behind them? On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army encircled Constantinople and the bombardment began. It was not like any siege in history. Every day the cannons roared. Every day sections of the outer wall crumbled into rubble. Every night, Byzantine work crews rushed out with rubble and timber and desperation, filling the gaps, shoring up breaches, knowing that when the sun rose, the cannons would erase their work and start again. The rhythm of it was maddening. Boom, crash, scramble, repair, boom, crash, scramble, repair. The giant cannon, Orban's masterpiece, fired 7 times a day. Each shot shaking the earth, each impact sending cracks, spiderwebbing through stone that had stood since the 5th century. Mehmed rotated gun crews, kept the bombardment relentless, gave the defenders no rest, no time to think, only react. And while the guns pounded the land walls, Ottoman sappers began digging tunnels, trying to undermine the fortifications and collapse them from below. The Byzantines countered by digging their own tunnels, listening for the sound of enemy picks, breaking into Ottoman shafts and fighting savage underground battles in the dark. Some tunnels were flooded, some were collapsed with explosives, some became mass graves where men suffocated in the black earth, clawing at stone they would never see again. But Mehmed's genius was not just in force, it was in psychology. He knew that Constantinople's greatest strength was its northern wall along the Golden Horn, which was lower and weaker than the land walls, but protected by the chain and the assumption that ships couldn't get past it. So Mehmed did the impossible. He built a road, a greased wooden road over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and on the night of April 22nd, he had 70 Ottoman ships dragged overland on rollers by oxen and soldiers, hauled up one side of a hill and down the other, and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The Byzantines woke up to find an enemy fleet inside their safe harbor. It was logistically insane, tactically brilliant, and psychologically devastating. Suddenly, the defenders had to man walls they'd thought were secure, splitting their already thin forces even thinner. Morale, already fragile, cracked. If Mehmed could move ships over mountains, what else could he do? What rule of war would he not break? The message was clear. There is no safety. There is no impossible. There is only the inevitable. By mid-May, the walls were a patchwork of repairs, the defenders were exhausted, supplies were running low. And Constantine knew that time was his enemy. Mehmed offered terms one last time: surrender the city, and your people will be spared. Constantine refused. He had no illusions about survival, but he had clarity about duty. If the city was going to fall, it would fall fighting, and history would remember that the last Roman emperor did not beg. Mehmed set the final assault for May 29th. He gave his troops 3 days to rest, to pray, to prepare for the storm. On the Byzantine side, Constantine walked the walls, spoke to his men, thanked the Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had no reason to die for a city that wasn't theirs, except that it represented something larger than national loyalty. It represented the idea that some things were worth defending, even when the mathematics said you'd lose. Giustiniani positioned his best troops at the weakest section of wall, the area near the gate of St. Romanus, where the bombardment had done the most damage. The plan was simple: hold the breaches, kill everything that came through, hold until relief arrived or the Ottomans gave up. No one believed relief was coming. No one believed the Ottomans would give up. The night before the assault, Constantinople fell silent in a way that felt religious. Men prayed in Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral whose dome had dominated the skyline for 900 years, its interior glowing with candlelight and incense, and the murmured desperation of people asking God for a miracle they knew wasn't coming. Some defenders wrote letters they'd never send. Some sharpened swords they might never draw. Some stood on the walls and looked out at the Ottoman campfires, thousands of them circling the city like a constellation of malice, and understood that they were looking at the future. Across the walls, in the Ottoman camp, men prepared differently. Janissaries cleaned their weapons with the ritualistic precision of professionals. Sipahi cavalry checked their armor. Engineers made final adjustments to scaling ladders, siege towers, platforms designed to bridge the rubble-choked breaches. Mehmed walked among his troops, promising them paradise if they died, plunder if they lived, and the eternal glory of being the men who conquered the unconquerable. He had orchestrated a symphony of violence, and at dawn, it would play. The assault began in darkness, 2 hours before sunrise, with a wave of irregulars, bashi bazooks, poorly armed, volunteers and conscripts whose job was not to win, but to exhaust the defenders, to make them waste arrows and energy and nerve on targets that didn't matter. They came screaming out of the pre-dawn black, swarming the breaches, climbing ladders, dying in heaps as Byzantine crossbows and Greek fire and thrown stones turned the walls into a killing gallery. For 2 hours they came, and for 2 hours they died. And when the sun finally rose over the Bosphorus, the ground outside the walls was carpeted with bodies, and the Byzantines were shaking with exhaustion, their arms heavy, their quivers lighter. Then came the Anatolian regulars, professional soldiers with real armor and real training, hitting the walls in organized waves, focusing on the breaches, trying to force their way through sheer disciplined persistence. The fighting became mechanical, brutal, intimate. Men stabbing over rubble piles, pushing, shoving, the air thick with blood and dust and the kind of noise that makes thought impossible. Giustiniani was everywhere, rallying troops, plugging gaps, his presence holding the line together by sheer force of will. For hours the Anatolians hammered at the defenses, and for hours the defenders held, but holding cost. Every minute someone died. Every minute the line got thinner. Then came the Janissaries, Mehmed's elite, his best killers, fresh and rested while the defenders were bleeding and exhausted. They advanced in silence. No screaming, no chaos, just the disciplined march of men who had done this 100 times and knew exactly how it would end. They hit the walls like a tsunami, overwhelming breaches through sheer coordinated lethality, and the Byzantines, who had been holding for 6 hours, began to crack. Somewhere in the chaos, a small gate, the Kirka Porta, was left unlocked, either through error or sabotage, and a group of Janissaries found it, slipped inside, and suddenly there were Ottoman soldiers behind the walls, in the city, attacking the defenders from the rear. Panic is contagious. The sight of enemy fighters inside the defenses where they should not be, where they could not be, shattered the Byzantine cohesion. Men started retreating. Giustiniani, the professional, the one holding the line together, took a crossbow bolt and was carried off the walls, bleeding and dying, and without him, the defense simply unraveled. Constantine saw it happening, saw the line buckling, saw the Janissaries pouring through the breaches, saw his empire ending in real time, and he made the choice every doomed king dreams of making. He tore off his imperial regalia, grabbed a sword, and charged into the breach with a handful of loyalists, fighting not to win but to die well, to make sure that when the historians wrote this down, they would say the last emperor of Rome died with a sword in his hand and enemies at his feet. No one knows exactly where Constantine fell. His body was never found, lost in the massacre, buried under the thousands who died that morning. But somewhere in the blood-soaked rubble near the gate of St. Romanus, the Roman Empire, which had started in 27 BC and survived plagues and barbarians and the collapse of the Western world, finally ended. The Ottomans flooded into the city like water through a broken dam. The massacre was brief, brutal, efficient. Soldiers poured through the streets, killing anyone who resisted, enslaving anyone who surrendered, looting houses, churches, palaces, stripping Constantinople of everything that could be carried, burned, or sold. The great libraries were torched, manuscripts 1,000 years old turning to ash. Hagia Sophia, packed with refugees who'd thought the church was sanctuary, was stormed, its treasures stripped, its mosaics defaced. The people inside dragged out to be sorted into slaves and corpses. By noon, the killing had mostly stopped, not from mercy, but from exhaustion and profit motive. Slaves were worth more alive. Mehmed entered the city on horseback, rode through streets slick with blood, and when he reached Hagia Sophia, he dismounted, entered the cathedral, and ordered it converted into a mosque, not destroyed, converted, because Mehmed understood symbolism. This wasn't just conquest, this was continuation. He was not erasing Rome, he was becoming it. The immediate aftermath was carnage measured in numbers that still stagger the mind. Thousands dead in the fighting, thousands more enslaved and sold in markets from Cairo to Crimea. The richest city in Christendom stripped down to its bones, and repurposed as the capital of an Islamic empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. Constantinople became Istanbul, and the Byzantine Empire, the last living connection to the classical world, became a historical curiosity, a name in textbooks, a memory of something that had once seemed eternal and had proven, like everything else, to be temporary. Mehmed took the title Caesar, claiming to be the legitimate heir of Rome, and for the next 400 years, Ottoman sultans would use that title, insisting that the empire had not ended, but merely changed management. But the consequences radiated far beyond the city itself. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Christian Europe, a psychological earthquake that shattered assumptions and forced a reckoning. If the strongest walls on earth could fall, then nowhere was safe. Castles, fortifications, the entire medieval logic of defense built around stone ramparts and high towers, all of it was suddenly obsolete. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules, and every king in Europe scrambled to adapt, building new fortresses with low, thick walls designed to absorb cannon fire, investing in their own artillery, racing to catch up with a technology that had just announced the end of an era. The refugee crisis was immediate and profound. Byzantine scholars, fleeing the Ottoman conquest, carried ancient Greek manuscripts to Italy, texts that had been lost to the West for 1,000 years, and those texts helped ignite the Renaissance, the explosion of art and science and philosophy that redefined European civilization. The Ottomans controlled the eastern Mediterranean trade routes now, strangling the flow of spices and silk from Asia, and European merchants, desperate for alternatives, began funding insane ventures to find new paths to the east, voyages that would accidentally discover entire continents and launch the age of exploration. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, they were all, in a sense, responding to the fact that the old roads were closed and someone had to find new ones. The fall of Constantinople was not just the death of a city, it was the hinge upon which the medieval world swung shut and the modern world swung open. It was the moment when the certainties of 1,000 years, that walls could protect you, that empires lasted, that some things were simply too important to die, collided with the ugly truth that history doesn't care about importance. It cares about gunpowder and logistics and the cold mathematics of who has more men and better weapons. Constantine XI died believing he was defending civilization itself, and maybe he was. But civilizations don't end cleanly. They end in smoke and rubble and the sound of cannons that shouldn't exist. Yet, battering walls that were supposed to last forever. And when the dust settled, the world that emerged was unrecognizable, shaped by the fact that on one spring morning in 1453, the impossible happened, and nothing was ever safe again.